This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Aurora, Age of Desolation, which is now live on Kickstarter.
Aurora is a new post-apocalyptic campaign setting for 5th edition that implements new subsystems for survival, exploration, and character creation.
To survive the Age of Desolation, great heroes are needed to go out and explore the world of Aurora. And as such, Aurora introduces new mechanical systems for exploration and survival, building on the core mechanics of 5e.
If you've been looking for a way to broaden the scope of the exploration mechanics and the survival aspects of D&D and making those more of a theme in your campaign, then Aurora is the perfect setting for you.
More than that, you can also make characters with a unique combination of ancestral traits prepared to take on this dangerous new world.
So make sure to follow the links below to get all the latest updates on Aurora, Age of Desolation.
And now, on to this episode. Greetings! My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
This is part 1 of our video series where we will be ranking all the classes in D&D 5e by their party roles.
Rather than doing an absolute ranking, which we thought was going to be really hard, which class is the best and which one's the worst, we decided that we would break it into our 7 party roles. Now, if you aren't sure what the 7 party roles are, there is a video that we've done before that describes in detail each of the party roles. You can check that out right up over there.
In this episode, we are going to be focusing on the Frontliner party role. This is a combat-focused party role that is often jokingly referred to as the tank or the meat shield.
Their job is to stand up at the front lines of combat encounters, take on enemy attacks, protect their allies, and be able to take all of the damage coming at them and still stand there to withstand the brunt of the force of the enemies.
There are many classes, subclasses, builds, and other options that can step in and fill this very important role on the battlefield, but which one stands above the rest? Let's take a look at the metrics that Kelly and I are going to be using to choose which classes will come out on top.
Now, naturally, there are so many subclasses, feats, spells, equipment, and multi-class options that can really drive some of the lower-rated classes into a position that they don't usually fill. So for the sake of our rankings, we're going to be looking at the big picture. As a stipulation, we are only going to give one class per role the S tier ranking, and that's the one that we think, personally, is the standout best option. So in general, our S tier is the best in the game, regardless of subclass choice. It means that this class, if you pick it, just naturally falls into this role.
A class that is S tier in this role, even if you don't build your character around it, is still going to absolutely excel in this role. And you probably have to work hard to make your character bad at this role if you're playing the S tier class of it.
If we give an A ranking, that means that the class is very strong regardless of the subclass choice. But some specific subclasses may push them to the power level of an S tier ranking.
A B tier ranking means the class is average at fulfilling this role. Oftentimes this class can step into this role as a secondary specialization, but they might have some subclasses that allow them to perform this role much, much better. But even in the best case scenario, this class isn't going to offer you options that approach the power level of the S tier.
When we give a C ranking, it means that the class is generally weak at this role, but might actually be fine with very specific subclasses or specializations. There might be options here to build the character to fit the role, but you are going to have to work to do that.
If we give a class a D tier ranking in this role, it means that you probably shouldn't even bother trying to fulfill that role as a member of that class in general. A class that receives a D ranking in a specific role might have one specific build or one specific subclass that is the exception that proves the rule. That still makes the class overall a D tier role in our eyes.
So with all that in mind, it should be noted that even if we are giving low rankings to some of these classes, it doesn't mean that you can't pick the right subclass, the right equipment, the right feats, and build them to help out in these roles. But if you are looking at making a well-balanced, well-rounded party that naturally fills all of these roles, it's sometimes helpful to know what the class is best at and what it might need to have some help in order to achieve.
And finally, we make these videos for fun discussion purposes and as an interesting thought experiment. Never let our rankings dissuade you from playing the character that you want to play, that fits the fantasy that you have for your character and your game.
Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's dive into the Frontliner. Now, interestingly enough, Monty and I mostly agreed with a few subtle differences on the rankings that we gave. We're going to go through the classes in alphabetical order and talk about the rating that we gave it and why.
And then afterwards, we polled our community for their thoughts, and we'll go through those results too. So let's kick things off with the Artificer. Kelly, how do you feel the Artificer does as a frontline character? I know you've played a couple characters that like this before.
So I personally think that the Artificer is actually a great choice for Frontliner. They're not necessarily the best choice by any means, but I do think that almost every subclass available makes a really tanky option. And with your Artificer infusions, several of the options have the ability to wear decent armor, especially if you're playing a Battlesmith or an Armorer, which is 2 of the 4 presented subclasses, which means half of the options for the Artificer are pretty decent frontliners. I think I'm going to give them an A here.
I think Artificers are very impressive as frontliners. You played an Artificer that had full plate armor, that was a Warforged, that stacked your AC with a shield, and also had the shield spell. And I think that you could crank your AC upwards of 30.
Yeah.
And I do think that that AC stacking is one of the strongest ways that you can build an Artificer to take the front line. The only problem is that tends to be the be-all and end-all of what you can be as a frontliner as an Artificer, because you're still dealing with a D8 hit die. You're still not getting full spell casting with the Artificer. Infusions help a lot in this respect. And the damage is not great. I mean, that's not a big part of the frontliner, but it is still a factor. And I still find that with the Artificer, you kind of have these weird resilience gaps. Because oftentimes as the Artificer, you have a good con saving throw, you have a good intelligence saving throw. There's more to being a good frontliner than having a really high AC. And I think that as soon as you get past the AC, that's when the weaknesses of the Artificer start to cascade. In addition to that, I also think you're not going to play a frontliner if you're playing an Artillerist or a Alchemist. I think for me it's a B. Again, the builds that are possible are really, really good. Absolutely A tier. But I think over big picture, I would give them a B.
Great, so let's move on to the Bard. Now, with the Bard, there are some really cool options in here to make a sort of frontline Bard. We've seen that you can actually build a pretty decent Swords Bard who can stand up on the front lines. But I do think that the options here are limited, and the primary concept of a Bard is not going to be that of a frontliner. For that reason, I think this gets a C. It's not the worst option, it's not a D, because there are numerous ways to make your Bard decent. Yeah. But those numerous ways are an exception to the rule.
Yeah, you can build a Valor Bard or a College of Swords Bard that has a pretty good AC, that can go up there, that can wield weapons quite well. And Bards have a good smattering of spells that can help them. They don't naturally get access to the shield spell. And I think a lot of the builds that focus on bringing the Bards to the front line often rely on getting those higher level magical secrets, or which, if you're not playing a Lore Bard, you don't get to level 10, but then if you are playing a Lore Bard, you don't get all the martial supports that you would want from Valor and from the Swords Bard. So I think it's possible to build kind of this constellation for a frontline character. But once again, I do think that you run into similar weaknesses and strengths to the Artificer. I actually think that the Bard can build a frontline character that has very impressive armor class-based defenses, because you can get a pretty good AC with that Swords Bard. You could get shield as a Bard if you through various means, and you can get good armor proficiencies. But as soon as you get past that, you end up with a character that doesn't necessarily have a lot of hit points, doesn't have proficiency in Constitution saving throws innately, and relies on spells to be tough and survivable, even though they get a couple abilities. And so I think that those things are things that, as the Bard, you can that a dedicated foe can just blow right through those sort of defenses, and you don't have anything kind of backing you up, especially if you're relying on a concentration spell. Like, for example, if you're relying on a concentration spell that is boosting your defenses in some way or boosting your offense some way, and that spell goes down, you're really in a tough situation. So I think it's possible to build a frontline bard. I just think that you really have to focus on that, and you end up with some pretty big weaknesses. That's a C for me.
So C from both of us for the bard, which I think makes sense. But now let's start talking about the barbarian. Now, the barbarian for me, the only reason why the barbarian didn't get an S tier is because we're only giving out one S tier. And I think there's one class that beats the barbarian. That being said, and we'll talk about this later on why it just gets beat a little bit. But let's talk about how good the barbarian is. I'm just going to say it's getting an A tier, and it is the highest A tier I can give.
Yeah, it's absolutely an A+.
The barbarian, we have seen time and time again. Both of us have ran campaigns with barbarians in it.
And played barbarians.
And played barbarians, and played alongside barbarians. And barbarians don't die. You can try your hardest to kill a barbarian. When I say try your hardest, I mean we're the DMs and we could just murder them if we wanted to. But if you're playing a fair game, I have seen our friend Josh play a barbarian. You fighting a dragon with you as the DM. You flew into the air with him in the dragon's mouth while he attacked. You chomped down on him. You dropped him 300 feet into the ground, flew down, pinned him to the ground, breathed fire only on him. And he got up and chopped the dragon's head off. And that was the moment that I was like, oh, barbarians, eh? And similar idea. I had a barbarian playing at my table. We were doing a war against an army of giants, and they were all on a castle wall, slinging spells, firing arrows. And the barbarian just went, well, I'm sick of throwing axes, hopped off the wall and charged the giant army and came out alive and on top.
And the big reason why barbarians are so survivable in this regard is because they have rage, which is going to give them resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage while the rage is in effect. This, combined with their D12 hit die and their natural proclivity to having a high strength and a high constitution score, because those power, obviously, their melee combat abilities, means that barbarians just have a bucket load of hit points, and that huge hit point pool is effectively doubled while they're raging. Now, of course, barbarians are still vulnerable to other forms of damage while they're raging, such as fire, lightning, acid, but there are subclasses that give them resistances to various damage types, and even give them resistances or immunities to things like charm and fear as well. And so, as a barbarian, you end up with a really good defensive package, regardless of what subclass you choose, because almost every subclass for the barbarian is going to give you some other survivability feature of some kind. Are there ones that are better than others, like the bear totem barbarian? You betcha. Are there ones that are interesting, like the features of the zealot, which makes you easy to raise from the dead? Very cool as well. But all of them kind of pack that along. This just means that I think especially for a newer dungeon master, I think that the amount of damage that a barbarian can soak is very impressive, because I think new DMs, they tend to use damage dealing enemies more so than they tend to use the more creative, tricksy foes. And so for a new DM who's mostly keeping to melee combat, the barbarian seems unkillable. And therein lies the rub, because as soon as you stop attacking the barbarian head on, that's when the weaknesses come out.
I also, as a DM, have a lot of fun. I have a brand new player playing a barbarian at my table right now, and it's fun to scare the party by having a bunch of enemies swarm the barbarian. Yeah. Everybody else who's much squishier goes, oh no, so many enemies. And the barbarian freaks out too, but they always survive. So we're both going to give the barbarian an A+. Now, the only weakness that we think that the barbarian has is, although it has great defenses, it does have some weaknesses in its ability to make saving throws and deal with other issues on the table.
I do think the other weakness can be their high-level mobility. As a barbarian, it's much harder for you to get access to things like flight and teleportation. And so as soon as your foes aren't kind of coming down to your level, that's when you really start to feel like, ooh, I'm having trouble.
Now, as we move on to the cleric is a really interesting option here because I think that the Cleric not only has the most subclasses available in the game, and then this weird divide of some subclasses get heavy armor at first level, others don't. Some clerics are more steered towards various spells that are excellent at making them more robust or slowing down or hurting enemies that come near them. There are many good builds for a cleric.
Yeah.
And clerics, especially the ones wearing heavy armor, are probably going to be on the front lines.
I think the Cleric is a class that can survive being on the front lines, but can't be the front line.
Whenever I play a cleric, I expect to be on the front lines. But if I'm playing in a party with other prominent frontliners, I'm relying on them more to take more of the damage while I focus on my job as a cleric. For that reason, I'm thinking B. My B ranking is, again, lots of great options here to build a very strong frontline cleric. But there are just as many options to not build it that way, and so I do think it lands safely in the middle, that entirely dependent on the subclass and the build that you create for your cleric. You can push S tier, not quite get there, or you might be in the C or D tier, depending on your build.
I just think the biggest thing with the Cleric is that so many times they have abilities that are buff centric, and so the question always comes down to, are you going to cast this buff on yourself or are you going to cast it on a party member? And a cleric who buffs themselves up could be very, very impressive, but oftentimes there's going to be another party member that with your buff, they're going to just excel so much more than you could on your own. And so the cleric really is someone that wants to focus on that teamwork. And so they have the classes like the Life Domain or the Forge Domain Cleric or even the Twilight Domain Cleric. You're going to be able to survive being up on the front. But I think that overall, if you're the cleric and you're the one getting all the hits coming at you, that's not the position you necessarily want to be in. You can take a hit or two, for sure, but you don't want all of them.
So we're in agreement on B.
Yeah, I think it's a really solid B, and I do think that there's probably some cool multi-classing that you could do here, but I think that, yeah, but overall it's a B.
I think as we move on to Druid, this one actually brings up a really interesting choice and a really interesting conversation because Druids have a built-in ability that makes them a good frontliner.
They have a built-in subclass, and that's the Moon Druid. And I think that that's literally the elephant in the room with the Druid. Because the challenge here is that the Moon Druid is one of the best, arguably the best, frontliners in the game. Particularly at varying levels of play. There's kind of this period where at low levels of play, the Moon Druid turning into a bear is super, super strong. And then it kind of has this weird middle period between, I would say around 8th or 9th level, it starts to weirdly drop off.
Until you get to turn into an elemental.
Until you get to turn into an elemental, and then you also get the higher level abilities that let you start casting spells when you're wild shaped and wild shape over and over again, then you basically have infinite hit points.
Yeah.
And so that makes the Moon Druid really, really strong at low levels, really, really strong at high levels, and able to get through there. But are we going to say that the Druid class overall is highly ranked just because of the Moon Druid?
No, I don't think we are. There are a few more points that I do want to give to the Druid, though. The Druid, all Druids have wild shape. At low levels, this makes all Druids okay at frontlining. I mean, you get to add extra hit points to yourself.
It's true, yeah.
Now, they also all get access to some pretty good summoning spells. And for me, something that a frontliner might that I'm actually going to talk about later in this episode, frontliners who have a companion, like the Battlesmith Artificer. Now you have double the amount of bodies that you can put on the front line. That being said, yes, Druids get summoning. Yes, Druids can wild shape. Yes, the Moon Druid might be arguably the best frontliner. But overall, I think that there's just as many elements that don't make you a good frontliner. And so I, again, am going to go with a B. And I think it's a very interesting B.
Yeah, and I do think that the Moon Druid does have weaknesses. As a character, there's some weird vulnerabilities that can happen to certain spell interactions. And I do think, again, the Moon Druid often presents that same sort of problem that the Barbarian does, in that the Moon Druid just puts a ton of hit points in front of the Dungeon Master and just says, come at me, bro. And what's unique about the Moon Druid is that you get to stack that with a really good Druid spell to concentrate on, because you cast a concentration spell, then become Bear. I also think you raise a really valid point about this idea of using summons as a surrogate for the front line. But I think that that's type of play, for me, that falls more into battlefield control, utility, and support style things, because I do think there totally is a possibility to make that character work and perhaps even be the front line, but it's definitely a high risk, high reward play style, I think, in D&D 5e. I think otherwise, if you're looking at the other Druid capabilities of being a frontliner, they don't have a lot of hit points, they don't have necessarily good saving throws, they have great spell casting, not really good armor proficiencies, not really good weapon proficiencies, no way to get extra attack innately. I would say you could make the case that a Druid is a C, possibly even a C- or worse, and that they're merely relying on the strength of the Moon Druid to like prop that up, but it's propaganda, Druid pop propaganda that they are, because if I'm willing to concede on the B, just to acknowledge the Moon Druid's strength, because the Moon Druid is above B by definition, right? But I think that if you took the Moon Druid off the table, are you going to really make a frontliner with a Druid?
So now we move on to the Fighter. Now, the Fighter is probably one of the most versatile classes in the game and is designed, in my opinion, to fill almost any combat role that you want. And for that reason, I definitely think the Fighter is an A in terms of frontline, because no matter what fighter you are playing, you can choose to be a frontliner if that's the playstyle you want to go with.
Got all the armor, you got good hit points, you got the con saves, and you got a lot of subclasses that are going to give you extra defensive tricks. Whether that is the Battle Master and all their maneuvers that are going to give you things like parry, riposte, all these other ways to get out of things. The fact that you get the extra feats that let you bolster your defenses by taking feats like Resilient and Mage Slayer. You kind of get to fill those gaps if they're gaps in your character overall. Or you can be an Eldritch Knight and then have shield and absorb elements and counterspell. There's so many options for you on the table as a fighter, no matter what way you want to go. And even if you're just building your fighter to be a damage dealer, you want to be a great weapon master, polearm master, sword and board, you're not doing the sword and board style, you're still actually really good on the front line.
So Fighter, both of us are giving it an A.
Oh yeah.
Let's move on to the Monk. The Monk, to me, is never a frontliner. And I don't see an option where they are the frontliner. I think that perhaps there's a couple builds that allow you to stand on the front lines with the better frontliners helping you out. Monks are skirmishers.
Yeah.
To me, they're the middle line. You have your meat shield. You're the one who runs in, beats up everybody, and gets out. You don't want to be on the front lines when it's the enemy's turn and you're surrounded by like 10 bad guys who are now all going to shank you. It's not a good time for a monk.
Yeah, the monk can get a good AC, but amazing. But like, even if you have like the maxed wisdom, maxed dexterity, you actually still can't do better than 20 really for your AC. There are ways, of course, of getting other abilities that might let you go beyond that, or racial traits, or what have you. You're working with a D8 hit die. Monks eventually do get proficiency in all saving throws, but that is a higher level feature that they have to them. I think that if you look at their abilities, they're mostly focused on being able to duck and weave around the front lines to pick out critical targets to hit them with Stunning Strike in their martial arts. The monk really wants to be far away from the front line when the enemy's turn comes around. Their abilities are geared towards getting them in, getting them out. You see that in the Shadow Monk, being able to teleport in. You see that in the Open Hand Monk with their pushes and pulls and being able to knock people prone. all the monks are giving them these dart in, dart out type abilities, you're not going to be standing holding that line.
So I think I'm going to give the monk a C.
I agree. I think that if you really had to stand up there and they do get the ability to take the dodge action as a bonus action, which is kind of neat, and they do have some staying power depending on how you build them. So you can exist on the front lines. It's much like the cleric. You can be there. I don't think a monk is more survivable on the front lines than a cleric by any stretch. And so I agree. It's a C for me.
So now we come to the Paladin, and I'm going to just go right ahead and say that the Paladin is my S tier frontliner.
Yeah.
Paladins, heavy armor, awesome weapons, great hit dice. Not only that, but they have abilities that allow them to add their charisma modifier to saving throws, and they have spell casting on top of all of that. They are by far, in my opinion, the best frontliner. And we talked about how the Barbarian was really close, but I think the separation here is that one ability that the Paladin gets, or, there's a couple things. There's the ability that the Paladin gets that lets them bolster all of their saving throws, as well as saving throws for the whole party.
Aura of Protection is just such a gangbuster ability. It's hard to look at any... when we had conversations with some of our other collaborators like Treant Monk and Colby, when we talk about like party composition, it's always who's playing the Paladin.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because not only do you want that aura of protection is such an amazing frontline ability, because not only does it apply to yourself, it applies to everybody around you. And then the Paladin on their own is going to, they come to the table with full plate and a shield. So they're getting right in the door with that AC at 20. There are ways for them to get higher than that. It's actually harder for them to get a super high AC compared to other classes, which is interesting. It's also harder for them to get a lot of hit points because they have a bit of an ability score spread. But the balance of resilience, armor class, and having the resistances to a wide variety of non-attack based things, backed up by things like lay on hands and spell casting, it just gives them a very complete package.
Yeah, it's hard to put down a Paladin, and Paladins, when we describe the front line, it's not just about absorbing hit points. It's about protecting the rest of the party from taking damage. It's about withstanding all types of attacks that might come your way. That includes spells, disabling abilities, and, of course, combat attacks.
Yeah.
And the Paladin is the best at standing up to all of them. The Barbarian is going to be able to withstand the most direct damage.
Yeah.
But the Paladin is going to be able to protect them and their allies from so many other disabling factors.
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to build Barbarians and Paladins, and depending on where your AC falls and where your hit points fall and how things stack up, you can be surprised at how much closer it comes than it looks like on paper, because Barbarians can get a really good AC, but they do have to invest in it in a very particular way. And oftentimes I see a lot of Barbarians just kind of not care too much about that armor class because they're like, oh, I've got hit points and resistances, and kind of discount how AC does lower the overall incoming damage. Again, I think the Barbarian still comes out ahead over the Paladin in this front, but it's not necessarily the clear-cut comparison of the that it seems like it is on paper.
A lot of Paladins definitely use lay on hands to bolster themselves, because if they go down, what's the rest of the party going to do?
I think that also with the subclasses, Paladins get so many other things and tools to the table. They have their turning undead abilities. They have a Vengeance Paladin who can teleport, and being able to teleport as a frontliner is a really amazing tool in your toolbox. So Paladins are going to bring all of these other kind of interesting bits of utility which help them greatly on the front lines.
All right, so we're both in agreement, Paladin, S tier frontliner. Let's move on to the Ranger, and you and I actually had a bit of a discrepancy, and it's interesting because it's a similar conversation for me that we just had about the Druid. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the Ranger, I gave them a B. Now, my reason for giving them a B is because there are a number of subclass options that actually make you pretty prominent at, if you are dual wielding blades, standing up on the front lines. I'm thinking now we have the Drake Warden, we have the Beastmaster. I think that there's even options for Swarm Keepers and Gloomstalkers to possibly armor themselves up, grab their blades, stand on the front lines, and kind of mitigate damage in really interesting ways. But again, we fall into the conversation of whether having a summoned pet is a frontliner, because there's multiple ways to do this with a ranger. And so I gave them a B. But what do you think?
Okay. Throwing down the animal friend decoy who absorbs a bunch of hits is absolutely a viable frontline strategy. I do think one of the things that we see that tends to happen with that strategy, and this is where I think it's where the ranger exemplifies it very particularly, is that sometimes things like animal companions and summons get annihilated by breath weapons and fireballs. Yeah. They just get wiped off the board by those types of abilities, and they usually don't have good ways of withstanding or surviving those types of things unless they're like resistant or immune to fire damage. And then when they don't, it's often really easy for enemies to ignore them because summon creatures generally lack things that make them sticky. Again, there's exceptions, but oftentimes it can be easy to get around a summon creature or an animal companion because even in the worst case scenario, often their opportunity attacks hit like a wet noodle. And so with the ranger, I look at the ranger and I see, okay, medium armor shields, dexterity-based class, some interesting base spellcasting, D10 hit die. But really, there's nothing to me that stands out for them. I think that if you strip away all those things, they've got less options for surviving on the front line than the cleric does.
Yeah.
So, should they be a C? Because I think the ranger might be in the same boat as a monk.
You might be right, and I think that even if I am I do feel that when I said B, that it was probably a B- at best.
Yeah.
So I think that we're in agreement that we'll put a B on my scorecard and a C on yours, but I do agree that they have some cool options, and I think that's what I'm excited about, is that they have some good options, and I actually think if I did play a ranger, I would probably play one that runs up to the front lines, but they are maybe a bit more of a skirmisher.
Well, I think it comes down to that same criteria that we looked at with the cleric. It's, can you survive the front line or can you be the front line?
Right.
And when we draw that kind of criteria there, I think that the ranger can absolutely survive on the front lines. They have the tools to go up and be in melee combat. Their animal companion really helps. But if we're thinking, okay, hey ranger, guess what? Here's a party of squishies that don't want to be anywhere near the front line. Can you do it?
Probably not.
No.
And so another discrepancy that we had is when we come to the rogue, and I actually feel like all of the same arguments are going to apply here.
Yeah.
I gave the rogue a C.
Totally. I think it's a D, personally.
Yeah. And I understand where you're coming from. Like, even during the conversations that we're having in this episode, I'm starting to see why I'm starting to see why you are giving the ratings you're giving. I feel like I'm being maybe a little too generous with these because the rogue, for me, the reason why it's C, again, a low score, and there aren't many options. But I do think that there are a few viable ways to actually make the rogue a frontliner. But I'm already second-guessing my rating of a C and starting to see why you gave it a D, because when I think of a rogue being a frontliner, I think of a rogue who is built to survive the front line and stand up toe-to-toe with enemies as a melee combatant. There are options.
But I guess we could say the test of the frontliner is, if I put a bunch of ogres in front of you, and behind you, you have a wizard... Can you keep the wizard?
Can I
save the wizard? And and the rogue can't.
Okay, well, fair enough.
At least the rogue might be able. Not that the rogue can't. It's just that if the only way out of that situation is you have to stand there and let those ogres hit you in the face, the rogue might be able to come up with some sort of creative solution to that problem. But that's not going to be a frontliner type solution.
That might be a utility solution.
Yes.
And I won't lie, the one time in our live stream campaign that I decided that Wilhelm was going to play the role of Frontliner was against a Hydra. And I got reduced to 0 hit points, and I'm pretty sure 1 round.
Uncanny Dodge is going to let a rogue survive that one stray attack that comes to them every round. Evasion is going to help them survive AoE attacks when they get caught in the range of a fireball. But it's not going to let them bear the brunt of those attacks. That's why I say that it's a D. Like, they just cannot be the brunt of the whole thing. So earlier we asked the question, can a rogue hold back a bunch of ogres from attacking the squishy wizard? And there's a reason why we use the wizard as the test case there, because I think the ranking for the sorcerer, warlock, and wizard all kind of fall into the same place. Because when I imagine the squishy that the frontliner has to protect, I imagine a member of one of these classes.
Yeah. You are protecting the sorcerer, warlock, and wizard. So we're going to lump these 3 together because from both of us, they all get a D ranking.
Yeah.
I will say there is an interesting point about the warlock, and that is we actually had a discussion on whether the warlock was higher than a D tier ranking, but that is only because of the Hexblade.
And ditto for the wizard because of the Blade Singer. And once again, this comes down to the Blade Singer and the Hexblade are the exceptions that prove the rule. The overall framework for both of these classes, especially if you are just cracking open the player's handbook, which doesn't have the Blade Singer and doesn't have the Hexblade, these classes are D tier in that ranking. And while you can build both Blade Singers and Hexblades to be really awesome frontline characters, both of those are what I would consider advanced builds.
Yeah.
Both of those have many very specific exceptions and weaknesses. And even both of those characters, I played Hexblades and I played Blade Singers, and in both cases, I still would have rather had a Paladin take the hits than me.
Yeah. So these are the classes that the frontliners are protecting. They are not designed to be the frontliners. That's just the way of it.
Yeah.
So D tier ranking for our primary spellcasters down here at the bottom of the list.
There just ain't no like again. They have tricks to survive.
But yeah, the tricks are not making you a frontliner. Tricks are utility and support roles, which these are all great at. Yeah. But when it comes to big enemies hitting you with big swords and big clubs, you don't want to be a wizard, warlock, or sorcerer in the way of those.
Yeah, sure. Your wizard can trap those ogres in a force cage. Problem solved. But that's not approaching the problem from the frontliner type role. That's approaching a problem in a very much a utility sort of way.
Let's take a look at Monty's scorecard and my scorecard for frontliners in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I think I was a little generous in a few places, but
I think you were cautiously optimistic.
I like to believe in everybody. All the classes are great. I love them all very dearly.
They are, and I think it's difficult, like, always in these conversations, the caveat that we have to be is that in your actual play experience, there is always going to be the great story of the time the wizard did stare down the 4 ogres. There will always be the epic stories of the exceptions. That's what makes them memorable. But don't necessarily test your luck.
So those are our rankings, but up on screen right now, let's take a look at what our community thought. It's pretty obvious here that there are 3 clear winners for who we think the best frontliners are. Our community definitely gave number 1 to Paladin, number 2 to Barbarian, and number 3 to Fighter. I think this makes total sense.
To summarize, we got 1,901 responses to our community poll, and of those responses, 41.9%, or 792 people, ranked the Paladin as the best frontliner, with 37.1%, or 701 people, giving that to the Barbarian. You're not wrong.
Yeah, that seems really obvious to me, and it's really nice to see that the community kind of rated it this way. I do think we had a few trolls in there, because we got 1 vote for Wizard, we got 1 vote for Sorcerer, we got like 1 vote for Warlock. Guess who didn't get any votes?
I had to double check this first, because I was like, what?
Where's the Ranger?
Yeah, that's not an error in our chart. Literally nobody chose the Ranger for the best frontliner.
Now, I understand this. Like, part of me is like, but I gave it a B. But at the same time, we asked people, who do you think the best is? Which makes me think, like, how did the Wizard get a vote, but the Ranger got none? But at the same time, why would the Ranger get one, but why would the Wizard get one? I don't know.
Someone's trolling us. But, or, you know, so either that or someone really believes in the Bladesinger. I'm also interested in where the Artificer and the Druid and the Cleric fell, which was all around the similar sort of result. And I do think that that speaks to the fact that these characters can be built to survive the front line. But I think that it comes back to that distinction once again between surviving the front line and being the front line. And I personally think that of the three, the Artificer, the Cleric, and the Druid, I think only the Moon Druid really can be the front line.
You have the Moon Druid, you have the Armorer and Battlesmith Artificer, and you have a number of decent Cleric options.
Yeah. And of course, we can't not mention that the Fighter was well received by the community. And I think that this is a very strong shoe-in. I just think that ultimately in the frontliner role, the Barbarian and the Paladin are a little bit more specialized than the Fighter is. The Fighter does have a lot of strengths in this regard, and I think that your Fighter will still be a super strong frontliner if that's what you want them to be as their primary role. I just think that the Barbarian and the Paladin do the job better.
So this has been a look at who is the best frontliner in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've played any of these classes or you have differing opinions from what we looked at today, sound off in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to our incredible Patreon community who helped us put together the criteria for these polls, tested them out, gave us their early opinions on how we should go about ranking these, and gave us the great suggestions of how to approach ranking the classes in D&D 5e. If you enjoy the videos that we create on YouTube and you want to join our patron-only Discord community and talk to us about these types of topics, follow the links in the description below.
And if you want to see some frontline fighters in actual play, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And if you enjoy tier ranking videos, we got lots of those on the channel. Check out those for all the subclasses in D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.